What's up, everyone? Happy Friday and welcome to the game here on Pax8 Live, show where we talk about all the cybersecurity shenanigans you need to be aware of, and it's been a very busy week for shenanigans. In fact, so much so that I don't think we'll be able to cover all of this week. With that in mind, we have a great show today. We're going to be talking about CIS controls, and I'm going to go ahead and steal the first acronym point of the show. CIS is Center for Internet Security, and they're the organization behind the controls. And today we have Phyllis Lee, who's the VP of Content Development at CIS, joining us. But first, let's jump into the news.
Man, Dom, I'm so happy to be here. And it would appear that your auditor facility has been shut down for the day. I don't know if they've left or something, but you do appear to be in a different place. So
I'm in the blue room at the office. Yeah, it's pretty nice.
I heard there's cookies there.
There are cookies, yes, and candy.
I missed out on
It's an all right spot to be. Yeah.
You know, what a whirlwind this week has been. I'll just take just a second before we launch a news article and just say how strange this has been, but really uplifting, right? You have the first article that we'll bring up, which is Jen Easterly stepping up and saying, you know, kind of almost Johnny foreshadowing style, that things were coming around changes for software vendors and their liability. And you see that immediately backed up by the national security policy that seems to echo very similar, you know, strategic plays saying the same thing. In fact, several of the pillars almost saying the accountability, the responsibility, the shift has to move towards these vendors that are creating it. But what's interesting about this, it says, hey, make companies liable for software insecurity, top cybersecurity official says. That's the title of this article. Let's just set the stage. And I just had this conversation with John Hammond and Wes Spencer a little bit ago. But companies buy software. They buy intellectual property. And then they smash it together with another product, and then they buy another piece of IP, and then they build something on it, and they extend it out. And the challenge is that capitalism doesn't reward them fixing problems that don't appear to be problems to the consumer. And so when it's a new feature, it gets put ahead of a bug. And we have these kind of challenges. And so I'm over summarizing part of it, but this article was like the shot fired on Tuesday, if I recall, with that opening speech. And Dom, what are your thoughts on it, man? This is big stuff, I think, for the future. Maybe not immediately, but
you'd almost think that Jen works for the guy who was coming up with the cyber strategy, or the guy who runs that.
You
team.
might think.
You'd think, yeah. But it's interesting to see. And Wes and Brad were talking about it. Brad Gross the other day, and Brad made some really good points about like how do you actually do that, particularly in legislature. And we probably go into SROs or self-regulating organizations ultimately, which is what CompTIA is really trying to do with their trust mark, in my opinion. But in either scenario or any scenario, I think a key point here is that it's about time, right? You cannot write code and just throw it out into the world and then call it a day, right? And I think, I won't name any names, but there are companies that's exactly what they do, and they don't care that there's a bug. They might know that there's a bug and still release the code. And to your point, some of us could scream from the rooftops for days that there's a bug or a vulnerability, and they won't fix it before they launch, the new UI that needs 14 more clicks than the last UI, because that somehow makes them money, right? So it's a tough one, I think, to actually see what this will turn into tactically, but I'm really excited that this is the stance that's coming out of the federal government.
Yeah, and what I think I want to highlight on this too is just how many MSPs immediately started saying one of a couple of verses, right? Regulations coming, our world's coming, this is going to destroy the little guy, this is going to stop the trunk slammer. I've heard every flavor of that. And I think they might be partially right in the sense that these type of things will now put the onus more and more squarely in the provider's hands to at least do no harm, right? To not serve the client that isn't going to do the things that are necessary, to not have hard stances of whether or not we deal with Exchange server patching, or you start getting into that world shifting. So I like this, and I like the implications of it. And
well, another point too to cover though is it doesn't eliminate the little guy, right, per se.
Right.
I think it eliminates the little guy that doesn't care, or that has this attitude that they can be in technology without being in security. And that little guy needs to be eliminated. Like that is, I'm sorry, but like that is a bad thing for the channel. You cannot touch the technology without touching the security, or being responsible for the security. And at the end of the day, if we really just tear it apart, I think that's the core of the message here, right? So I think if you're doing the right thing, and in that same speech, Jen talked about safe harbor for those that are doing the right thing. with the understanding that you, especially if you're a code producing entity, you can't not have bugs. That's not a thing in development. Right. You will have bugs. But I think if you're doing the right thing and you get that safe harbor, which again is hard to define, but I think if you're the little guy and you're doing the right thing, this doesn't wash you out.
And yet, though, it isn't hard to define in the sense that the only precedent, if you go back to Brad's statement and if you go back to these things that exist today, is really reasonable person. Well, how does one become reasonable? Guess what? Follow a framework. You want to know one? CIS, right? And try to do it the best you can and show iterative improvement and be humble about the things you suck at and be honest about the things that you're trying to make better, right? Like, those are my takes on how one builds a reasonable effort. And I don't care if you're one person or if you're 40. It's about thinking through that lens of, I'm not the smartest guy or gal in the room. I'm going to find outside standards that I can adhere to. I'm going to build and increase my capabilities with it. And I'm going to be able to tell a story to my peers about that. So get off this soapbox. It's just been on my heart so big this week. And I can't not get passionate about seeing this kind of change in our government. So let's move on to that next article where we're going to talk about that same government with fingers pointing right back at themselves. Unfortunately,
here's the other four fingers.
yeah. So there's one pointing out, and yet unfortunately on the way in. Dom, you want to kick us out through what this one is, please?
Yeah. So it wasn't that long ago we were talking about an FBI cybersecurity incident, right, that they were dealing with, and now we're talking about the U.S. Marshals Service, and this one immediately got my attention because if you're not familiar with what the U.S. Marshals Service does, they have two big charters.
Am I
right?
too
one of
familiar
them,
oh, sorry.
One of them is pursuing bad guys that are at large, right? Fugitive apprehension. They have like Navy SEAL level teams that do crazy crap, but they also manage a lot of data to be able to do that. And their other key function is what we call WITSEC, or the Witness Security Program, Witness Protection. They basically can erase your identity so that, the mob boss can't find you after you testify. Now, thankfully, this attack did not apparently impact WITSEC, which would have been an absolute nightmare. So there's not much details around what was really impacted, except they've said that it's not WITSEC, and they've said that it's law enforcement sensitive, which is a real thing. That's not just a term. That's a real, that is a label on data. Law enforcement sensitive is sort of like CY in the law enforcement world, right? So it'll be interesting to see where this goes, but I do think this is another example. Just like the FBI came out and said, hey, something's wrong here, the marshals are coming out and saying, hey, something happened here. And I think that's a lot in and of itself of progress to where we would typically not hear about a federal breach until it got leaked by a whistleblower.
Or ever. Yeah.
Or ever, yes.
I think you call out a great point. That's the one I was going to make too, is that this is now in 2 or 3 weeks, as many federal agencies actually speaking up and saying, hey, we found something, we dealt with it, we're not sure what it is. This is what, they have no benefit to that transparency, right? There has not been in history a real value in that. I mean, even when the FBI email service got hacked, this was like 2021, mid 2021, there was a subdomain they used to use that got compromised. Nobody talked about it. It didn't make the news. They didn't ever say anything about it. Yet here we have them telling on themselves about a single asset, one machine that was discovered on Feb 17, and that they disconnected it from their, began a forensic investigation, believed that sensitive data was touched. Like that transparency in 5 days, 6 days. Yeah, I would definitely say I think we're seeing a change in some of our powers that be in their own growth in that space, right, in the incident response piece. So,
but do not hold your breath. You're not going to get any more details about it. All right,
probably not ever again. Yeah,
the marshals do not do things that. But it happened. That's what we get to know.
It's a one-way data vacuum, unfortunately. Sometimes I got on my. I'll be doing a show about that with Darren Mott, former FBI agent, here pretty soon. But anyways, let's go on to that last article. I think we beat this to death. This is actually one where I really want to highlight a very positive thing. If we look at Control 15, if we look at trying to understand the lens of Control 16, right, 15 being service provider management, 16 being application security. When we think about that, we really, and even further evidenced with the National Security Strategy and Easterly, really have some due care as MSPs of who we choose to do business with and who we choose that we're going to do and what vetting we've done and how much validation we've done to prove that we've actually done our part of due care for an uneducated consumer, right? And as we do that, I want to applaud Jeff and his team at Cloud Radial. I've been on their advisory from a security perspective for a while, just as part of what I volunteer and do, and Pax8's blessed enough to sponsor my meals for me to do. And so I like this because they put up a security page and they talk about how we hire. We do thorough background checks. We have software development. We design software with security in mind, with potential threats. We develop using only continuous updated industry standard platforms. We conduct component and vendor evaluations. We develop only on company-owned assets and use MFA. Like, these are bold statements that all echo controls. Right? Every single one of these points that are being made are a control somewhere in CIS. When you start thinking about MFA, you're in the 5s, somewheres in the 6s. You start talking about software development, you're in the 16s. You start getting into hosting, and all of those things are showing that they're doing their own due care. And so I often use the news to beat up on people, but I want to equally do when I see something going really well. So shout out to Cloud Radio.
To even add to that, we've been talking to Jeff for a while. Or the Cloud Radio folks for a while, and what I've liked about them is they really listen. So this is a direct result of a whole lot of partners that came together with him and said, hey, here's where our concerns are, and he turned around and took that feedback and addressed it, and he did it pretty damn quick too, which was really cool to see. This wasn't a we'll think about it. Yeah, it just didn't take long. It was a few meetings, and he said, hey guys, I'll go work on this, and he did. So I think this page is exemplary of what we would expect a vendor, particularly in the channel, to share, but also do that same listening, right, to your partners and to the people who are trying to help you, and apply it, because this is the result. I think it's fantastic.
Well, and let's talk about this from talk about this in real words in English.
Take about it.
Let's take about this. Let's talk about this from the lens of reasonableness, right? In this document, he's really not proven anything to me. He really hasn't in any way on this webpage given me any empirical data that he's done the things he said. What has he done? Right. He's built a reasonable argument that I believe he's thought through these things in a way that give me evidence that he's likely doing them. Right? When you start reading through the thought that went into it, and it ends in continual improvement, saying, hey, best practices for security and compliance are constantly evolving. Cloud Radio is always learning from our partners and integration partners, experts, and the industry on ways to improve. That's thought through. That gets into the iterance and understanding that security and policy aren't some static thing that you achieve. They are simply a way of life. So anyways, I can't be in more love with this, but I also want to point out that lens works for you as an MSP. If you were to have an ethos of the things that are your I am statements, I will statements, I do statements, and then strive to actually do those, you're going to have a very, very reasonable statement and story to tell around your cybersecurity missions, in my opinion. So, all right, Dom, what do we have next, buddy?
Oh, I believe Robin's joining us for Level Up, right? We're going to talk about certifications. You know what?
I always need to level up. Let's get into some certification magic.
Let's talk about cloud certifications. Almost all platforms, I know AWS and Azure, have certifications that take you all the way from beginner, business appropriate knowledge, all the way to being a security or architect expert. And the reason you might want to consider just the foundations is if you are putting your business in the cloud, if this is where your business is operating from, it gives you a foundation of knowledge and understanding about the environment, and it will also help you understand what your responsibilities are when you put your data and your business operations into a cloud environment. Because a lot of people assume that when they put their business in the cloud, that means all the risk is assumed by that cloud provider. And that is absolutely 100% not true. And the other thing is it will allow you to have these intelligent conversations with other providers and services, because you will have some basis of the language that they use when they talk about this environment. The other thing that's really, really important is the concept of being a lifelong learner. Anybody in the technology field understands this industry changes like 5 years is ancient, so every year the technology is changing, and it's changing faster, and it's becoming more a staple in our lives. But if we don't keep up, if we don't keep our knowledge and understanding at the level it needs to be, we're actually creating an unnecessary risk for ourselves, because as the technology changes, some things that were okay yesterday may open a door for a risk or a threat to emerge today. So we've got a few links for you. Azure and both AWS do an amazing job of working with training organizations to deliver both free and low-cost training and a great experience for becoming certified. Today's business owner and people that operate within a business that are interacting in any way with technology almost have a duty. I would say it's a duty to actually maintain a certain level of knowledge and awareness of what's going on in the industry, because we're in an industry where learning and staying knowledgeable can make the difference between something going very wrong and something going smooth. So that's my take on it.
I love that so much. That's such a hugely important point, is shared responsibility matters. And you need to be paying attention to it with whoever you do business with, whether they're your customers or your providers. So I really love that she called that out there.
Yeah, 100%. And the concept that things are changing constantly, right? And that's even a challenge for CIS, I would imagine. We'll maybe tackle into that here in a bit, is that they do a lot of baselining. Well, baselines have to shift, and you have to stay into the matriculation of that and management of it. So anyways, without any better option or way, let's definitely introduce Phyllis Lee, who owns almost all of that content now at CIS, and you've been very involved with the controls. So Phyllis, introduce yourself, tell our audience, who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. Phyllis Lee. I am the Vice President of Content Development here at CIS. That means that the benchmarks, which are secure configuration guides, and of course, critical security controls, fall underneath me. And so I'll be coming upon 5 years this April at CIS. And prior to working at CIS, I spent 25 years at no such agency, or NSA.
That's fair. That's fair. And I have to imagine that coming out of that space and seeing the intelligence and dealing with a little bit of the background of research of your world of trying to implement controls, try to protect what are very, very sensitive nationwide secrets. So I imagine that's an interesting and valuable back set of data to transition into your role. But tell me about, when you left and exited the government and you came on to CIS, where was the control family at that time? What's the backstory of you joining CIS, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. So, I worked at the NSA for 25 years. I loved it. I love that mission. The bulk of it was spent in defense. And just like you said, we used to say, because, we had blue team, we had red team, and we used to say, oh my gosh, how many times are we going to find out that people didn't patch? How many times are we going to find out that it's just the same? It's, the same things over and over again. And it's really the basics or the essentials, essential cyber hygiene. It's never anything super fancy. It's, it's like, let's just make the adversary work a little bit harder, please. Just a little bit harder.
Right.
Or,
can we at least put on boxing gloves? Right.
Yeah.
Maybe a helmet.
Maybe a helmet.
Exactly. And at that time, I really wanted to just spend more time at home. I reached out to Kurt Dukes, who's the EVP and General Manager of Security Best Practices here at CIS and a former NSAer, and my former boss. And I said, hey, I'm looking to telework. I thought I would go to a different 3-letter agency that teleworks. And he's like, hey, how about a small nonprofit? And, the CIS controls started at the NSA. Just a brief history. They started as, hey, what's our top 10 list? Every nation has their top 10 list. A lot of them do.
Yeah.
The UK has Cyber Essentials. Australia has the Australian 8. NSA had this top 10. And it really came about where the DoD said, we do need to figure out how to spend our monies. Spend our money on At the time, it was not called cyber; it was called information assurance, and it was what can we do? And they looked to the NSA, the DoD did, and so as Tony would say, it's like five schmucks in a room. And I would say, thinking about what are good things to do? What gives us a warm fuzzy in our tummy, right? Not necessarily, backed by a ton of data, but just through experience.
Sure.
Alan Power over at SANS heard about it. He called up Tony Sager and said, you know what? Let's make that a little more wide, a little more public. So he had the SANS megaphone. So it went out to like thousands, like 5,000 experts and friends of SANS, right? Because SANS had a big megaphone.
Sure. Yeah, it was huge at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so then more and more people got involved, including NSA, but other SMEs from industry. And that became the SANS Top 20.
Now you did just use SME, and you didn't take that acronym out. So we have a problem.
I'm sorry,
here. We
security
have to define
matter experts, subject matter experts. Sorry, subject
awesome.
matter.
Okay. Point
Subject
returned
matter.
for Phyllis. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they brought in the SMEs.
We brought in SMEs, and so the controls had evolved over time and it was the SANS Top 20. When I came on board, the CIS was just releasing version 7.
Okay.
And it still was the top 20. We then released under me when I took it over, version 7.1, which introduced implementation groups. And that really came about from organizations, always asking, how do I start? Where do I start?
Right.
And it used to be start with the top 6. And when I went out and talked to organizations, I realized, wow, they're going 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. Sure. And by the time you get to backups, which was control 10 at that time, you're like a year into your program and you haven't thought about backups. That was not good, right? Especially given ransomware.
So I actually have a story about this. I'm going to get in a fight on stage at CCF with Kris Johnson. And the fight is just about this. He is a big believer in pull up your big boy and girl pants and just do them all. And just get it done right now. And I said, no, Kris. I'm a big believer in implementation groups. I think that if you get the early basics done and come back with a fresh set of eyes after doing them all, you have more context and you can now do them better and iterate on them. And so we're actually going to get in a knockdown drag out. If you're listening, Kris Johnson, like, I'm going to win. I'm going to use my good eye. Like, seriously. So this is going to get crazy. But no, that's funny. I'm glad you brought the IGs. It's how you walk them down that journey. So anyways, back to your point.
No, you're absolutely right. People literally were following
1.1, 153 of them. Yeah.
And it's like, oh my gosh. Wow, people are really taking what we say seriously. And so literally. And so that's how we came up with implementation groups. We said we need to really cut across all the controls and help with that prioritization and start with what's doable. What is it that a small organization, small, medium business can actually achieve? And that's how we came up with implementation groups. And I will tell you, even large organizations, I've talked with Fortune 100 organizations. You can put this in your pocket when you're fighting with Kris. They can't implement all the controls all at once. We've gotten that feedback. Mm-hmm. And so those organizations even start with implementation group 1.
That's awesome. I'm definitely using that. I will actually quote Phyllis Lee on MAR 3, 3:23 p.m. Central Time. I just want to lay this out there. I also don't misquote you, I hope, on this one. One of the most fascinating Phyllis Lee quotes I use all the time is, your user's network ends, or your network as a company ends, where your user's fingertips land. Right. Yes. You said that at a conference one time, and I was inspired by it because it's the definition of the death of the moated castle as a way of protecting oneself. Right. It's this understanding that your users are everywhere. So have I misquoted that one, or are we good to continue using that as a Phyllis Lee quote?
Right. No, you're absolutely
awesome.
Right. We're used to crunchy outside, soft inside. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
And you can't do that anymore. And what's interesting is, and I'll talk about the history. So version 7.1 got us the implementation groups. And then, we reached kind of this tipping point where I thought, well, now's time for controls version 8. It was 3 years after version 7. And I was like, we need to include cloud and mobile. People are in a hybrid environment. Yes. We've got to include those into the main document.
Sure.
And then as we were starting to create controls version 8, a pandemic happened. And it drove home even further.
It did. It further solidified that point for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a mass migration to the cloud, right? And so we created version 8 during that time. And your network ends where your users' fingertips are is about the fact that, networks are boundaryless at this point, right? Your enterprise doesn't have that hard exterior. So we reorganized the controls based on activity versus it used to be kind of who manages it, right? You've got your network admins, you've got your typical sysadmins. And so you'd see have a secure configuration for your network boundary device under the network boundary device control, have a secure configuration for endpoints under, more endpoint type control. So we consolidated by activity, like do audit logging, secure configuration, et cetera. And so that's why we went down from 20 controls actually to 17 by doing that consolidation. And then we added a control on service provider management, which bumped us up to control 18. 18 controls. So,
and I think it was timely, right? Because NIST CSF doesn't really account for that in its current version. It has no real concept of that SP management side. And you have to imagine as control family 18 or version 8 was being made, it was during the Kaseya and the SolarWinds events. It was during or after, some of that major kind of watershed understanding of just the risk that exists in that supply chain risk, right? And so I have to imagine that was a part of that conversation at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of grumblings around, supply chain management, and people talked about, should we do that? Should we address that? And I don't want to address necessarily supply chain management. That's a much bigger thing than just one control with some safeguards. But we did want to address, you have other third-party service providers. You need to know who they are, and you need to figure out who has what data and who's responsible for protecting what, right? And you need to look at those service level agreements. You need to look at those contracts and figure that out on a yearly basis. And so the group felt very strongly about that, and we included. I'm so glad we did.
Oh, you're Johnny foreshadowing here, right? I mean,
it's spot on.
That service provider, it now speaks towards national cybersecurity strategy. So I would argue that you got a +1 in the column there for that prescience.
Thank you.
One thing that I have a question about is, so when you were going through that delta, when you're pushing back in a world that is, dominated by a bunch of egos, and I think as you're stepping into that SME world, those early days of version 7 and wanting to change it and wanting to drive in IGs and all, how did that go? Was that an easy experience? Did you feel equipped to win that fight? Were you well received?
So, there were some strong opponents to it, right? People have their pet, this control, this safeguard is important and everyone must do it, right?
Yeah.
And, we have guiding principles on the controls team. And we brief everybody, when I created controls version 8, I was like, here are guiding principles. And then I had to pause in the middle and brief them again. Because people are very passionate and I appreciate their passion, as you both know, when you're trying to work on a group project and everyone has their opinion. So implementation groups, there were some strong opponents to some of these, fighting for, hey, we need application whitelisting in there. Hey, we need, what? No pen testing, and so there were some really passionate folks, and some people got really upset, but we have to remind people, we are the stewards of the controls. We have boundaries on what belongs in implementation group 1, 2, and 3. Sure, they can change over time, but here's our rationale and here's what we do. And, we try to be as transparent as possible. And I would say for the most part, most organizations, I would say 98, 99% of folks really like the implementation groups. We've gotten the majority of positive feedback, but we do
not
get
Kris Johnson, but everybody else,
not Kris Johnson.
And we do get the occasional, hey, maybe you should bump this up into IG1. It's mainly people wanting to put stuff in IG1, not out of IG1.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you think about it, I think there's no Control 16, there's no Control 18 that have IG1s. And, a little bit bringing it back to point, we had John Strand on our show talking about Control 18 with us for obvious reasons. It's kind of his jam.
Yeah.
And I poked him a little bit, and I started pontificating about my version of why it was 18. It was because you had to know yourself really well. And why, if you're not going to even lock the front door, why would you ask someone to test to break in? Right. That was my argument for the reasoning and why it would be 18. And he stops and he says, Dom, you were on the show with us. And he says, no, we just were sitting there and didn't know where it goes. And so we just put it at the end. So what are your thoughts on that statement? I like to create a little rivalry here.
I mean, here's my thing. Why would I ask someone to pay $20, $30, $40, $50,000 for a pen test when what's going to come back? Your software's out of date. You didn't lock down these ports, right? It's going to be all those basic things that you should have done. Oh, did you know that you had critical data over here and you never locked it down?
Control 3.
Right?
Yeah,
Control 3. Oh, it's going to be access management. You have weak passwords. Oh, it's going to be all those things that people are going to find in a pen test. I'm like, why did you just spend $40,000, $50,000 on a pen test? And then the remediation, you know what the remediation is going to be? Do implementation group 1.
Right. I feel validated right now, Phyllis. Thank you. This is returning me back to my belief statement of where I started. This is foundational. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, why pay for that when we already know these are the things you need to do, and these are the things that most organizations don't do. Go ahead.
Here's the sad part about this, and his argument was right too. You know what his argument was, Phyllis? He said, because once we show executives a failed pen test with all these findings, they finally have motivation to actually solve it. And so I almost think he's working through the broken system, right? In his argument that they pay for this pen test and then they finally fix it when their people have been screaming, hey, let's just do CIS. Anyways, thoughts on that?
I would say yes and no. So I would say the organizations that are paying for a John Strand pen test are more security minded and probably kind of halfway down that path. Do you know what I mean? I would say the bulk of organizations aren't paying for a pen test, right?
Yeah,
and
I would agree with that.
Get started. And so, hey, if you want to pay for a pen test, I'm not going to stop you. More power to you. But I don't think the majority of organizations are there yet.
I agree. And
an important thing to point out, too, is when we say pen test, we mean an actual pen test where we're doing
not the $99
stuff. Not the $99. You said it. Yeah. No, but we're not talking about $99 pen tests. We're talking about actual pen tests. And that's why we're talking about $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 is because very talented people who are very talented at getting into things, right, come from offset places are trying to get into your environment. Point of clarity, we're not talking about pen tests. We're talking about pen tests.
Real pen tests, which again is a syntax challenge that I think CIS is helping with, right? I think one of the things that I love about your controls, Phyllis, is, and if anybody hasn't seen this, there's a definitions page. There's a fairly robust, here's the acronym, here's what we're talking about, and here's a definition. But I think that we have, as an industry, for too long, allowed Gartner to set our terms, as opposed to us setting our terms for things, right? And this pen test conversation is one of those. Yeah, I'm top right though. It's fine. I'm pen testing for $99.
Magic. You're the magic one.
Exactly. So bringing us back to the point though. So as you bring in the CIS controls, there's an interesting part, and I'll point at my own ignorance and my own growth in this space, is that I don't know that I've ever read 1 through 6. Right. And so there's this, even though they were in different places at the time, do you feel that the world is changing for how receptive we all are to a control family like CIS in this V8 and further iteration than back in the V7 days? Do you feel like there's a movement to adopt more?
Absolutely. I see a strong uptick in outreach towards CIS for controls implementation. From organizations such as MSPs that have not been regulated yet, but know they need to do something. Right. And from organizations who are not resourced very well and like the fact that, and they got exposure to the controls and like, these are easy to read. I can understand them. You've given me the priority. Great. And I love that we get that feedback. I love that people hear about us, and I do see that uptick. And I'll tell you, you're talking earlier about reasonableness. So, another indicator for me, not just from outreach and organizations coming to us, is the fact that more and more we're seeing the controls mentioned in state legislation for incentivized implementation of a controls framework. Yep. In Connecticut recently, like last year, Ohio was one of the first ones. And we're seeing this wide adoption across the US of controls along with NIST CSF. And so this idea of reasonableness, when you were talking about that earlier, is something that has hit home with us as well. And on my to-do list this year is to define what is reasonable when it comes to implementing CIS controls, right? How is it that you're not going to get sued in a certain state, or how is it that you get that safe harbor law, or you have perhaps an upper bound on what you can be sued for? What does it mean to prove in a court of law that you reasonably implemented the controls? And so that is on my to-do list. And so yes, and it's so interesting that you mentioned
prove the effectiveness, right? Like if we didn't have those safe harbors, I feel like it'd be a lot harder to drive the value of frameworks. But when states start doing that and recognizing that, these are and I always call it academic, and I'm probably picking the wrong word, but when I explain the idea of a framework to people, I always compare it to academia, and that a whole lot of people have touched this and had thoughts about it, right? And then it's published as a community. And I think Safe Harbor and more organizations as they come out and promote frameworks in general, and I don't think it's a competition, although I wish NIST was a little less nerdy on their controls, just a little bit. But it's not a competition. I think no matter what framework you're looking at, it's academic, and that for me is what makes it defensible, is that I didn't think up any of this. I'm just thinking up solutions to each of these problems presented to me, right?
Yep. Yeah. And the other piece about this, and Phyllis, I wanted to let you share in this win with me and Dom on this one. So Dom, I got reached out to by a partner in Australia, and I won't say the names or do the graphic right now, but I have the text messages from it. I'm waiting on permission. But this person reached out and said, hey, I just went through an insurance audit for one of my customers, and they actually required read-only rights to my Microsoft domain, to my Azure Active Directory, to all my resources for that. They wanted to read. And I got a 95% score on an automated read-through of the settings. The insurer then went on to tell me most people fall well below 60%, and he's not seen one at 95%. He went on to say that the reason for that was a year ago, he sat down in my Australian version of the CIS, applying CIS controls class that I use your CIS controls on, Phyllis, and he's implemented them for a year. And he said the reason he got that 95 was because of that push and that implementation and that strive that I call out in that class of, you build reasonableness through iterance. You build reasonableness through proving you thought about it, and you've thought again, and you've thought again until you can't think about it anymore. And so if you ever get started down that path, Phyllis, I would love to sign up as a SME on some of that work and talking about what is that upper limit and how do you define showing and proving reasonableness from that perspective. I'd love to participate if I can. So,
okay, no.
Very cool.
Definitely.
I
love that story too.
Thank you. I was so happy that you started us down that path and that you allowed me to pay the license fee so that I can speak about it. So it's fantastic. We got a question from Cam Goldman, and he says, has CIS worked with the state of Louisiana, who has had some conversations about MSP Business Registry and other states? Do you have anything you can talk about? I actually have a story about that, but I'll save it for you. Phyllis, have you heard about CIS working with Louisiana yet on any of this?
No, not. I have not heard about that yet.
So I'll share mine. I roundabouts, you already are. So Kris Johnson, the guy that doesn't believe in IG 1, 2, and 3, but Kris Johnson is meeting with the Secretary of State about Trustmark as being a path for that. And if you haven't dug into what
Secretary
Trustmark
of
is,
State
sure
of
you
Louisiana,
of Louisiana, yes, thank you for the clarification, Dom. And so he's meeting with the Secretary of State of the state of Louisiana, but Trustmark's based on all of IG 1, 2, and 3 of CIS, plus some things that I agree with him are gaps. There's gaps in governance. There's gaps in physical controls in CIS that aren't present. But he's made Trustmark to be a amalgamation of about 200 plus controls that all walk an MSP through CIS. And so it turns out that vis-a-vis that lens, CIS may be a core part of the state of Louisiana's strategy for MSPs here in the future. So,
well, and CIS and any framework will be central to that, right? You have NIST coming out with CSF 2.0, which adds that govern function, and I would anticipate perhaps CIS 9 might have a govern function, but regardless of the framework, you can even take.
It's Phyllis. She has to do an 8.1 first. That's her style.
Oh, right. Sorry, 8.1. That's my bad. Yeah.
I mean, 8.1 is probably going to be out at the end of this year.
All right. See, it's coming.
See, Matt knows
but,
me. Matt knows
you heard it right here.
I think any regulation will be framework. If you look at CMC, it's built around 800.171, right? Everything will be framework based. So I think organizations like CIS being able to get in there and take the community feedback that they do is massive. And that's how we avoid not untenable, unreachable regulation, right? Like doctors are somewhat self-governing with government-backed law, and accountants, and Brad was talking about lawyers the other day. I think that's where we're going, and I think an organization like CIS or a combination thereof, it was Connecticut that said, hey guys, you can do CIS V8, you can do NIST CSF, and I think there was another one, and there's a few different things in their law. They gave you the choice, and they said pick a framework and follow it, and there's your safe harbor, if you can prove you're following it, obviously. And I think that's where I see this going, is where maybe there's some choice in some arenas, but it's absolutely going to be framework based, because the government is not just going to come out and say, here's a new framework, you have to use this one, right? It's just not. I don't foresee that being acceptable, at least in the U.S.
The other side that this works down. Go ahead, Phyllis.
No, go ahead, Matt.
No, your turn. We're gonna have a Canadian standoff here.
I was going to say, no, I agree with you. I think, Tony Sager calls it the fog of more, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the U.S. government has finally heard that, all these organizations are just suffering under all the different regulatory frameworks that they're subject to. And they're just nuanced enough and just different enough, and have different auditors that organizations have to, look at implementing hundreds of frameworks in, who n squared, n factorial different ways, depending on how you get audited, right? And it's just too much. Right. It's too much. And so, we at CIS really are trying to get implementation group 1 as kind of that minimum standard where, people cannot, small organizations especially, cannot implement all these different frameworks in total. So let's just implement essential cyber hygiene. Let's go back to the basics,
right?
And just make things a little bit harder for everybody. For the adversary. Sorry.
Well, and I mean, joking aside, a little bit for everybody, right? But that is the nature of safety. It's harder for me to get in my car sometimes and turn it on without beeping and about my seatbelt. It's harder for me, to turn off the traction control on my vehicle so that I could use all of the horsepower. It's those things do exist for a reason, to that point.
Yes.
So I agree. One of the other questions I'd have about is, let's talk about where the future of a CIS is going. In your own vision, you're now VP of all of the content under this, right? From both the baselines and that. Do you see yourself including that same track record of SMEs and bringing them in to co-create that content in the market? Or do you see growing that in-house? Or tell me a little bit about your future and what your vision is.
And so we are always looking for SMEs to help us create our content. And I'm always looking for feedback to figure out what content should we be creating, right? And so benchmarks, which are secure configuration guides, we're always looking for external SMEs. We cannot be experts in all those different technologies. It just cannot happen. And so we're always looking for folks. Same thing with controls. You talked about governance. We get asked about that a lot. And so we are creating a guide on, where does a controls framework belong in your governance program, a controls framework like CIS. That isn't inclusive of everything, right? It really is more technical and really more focused around cyber. And so what does that mean for an organization? And we want to look at SMEs for review, for input, and looking at, of course, reasonableness. And so a lot of the content or additional content that we create outside of, the main controls document is created because organizations ask us of it. So an example would be implementation group 1 templates.
Yep.
We do a lot of work with K-12. K-12 reached out to us and said, we just did an assessment. The state of Michigan was incentivizing assessments against controls. And we failed every .1 that said create a policy. We never had to create these security policies before, right? Because why would they? It's more recent that they were all online, right? And so we're like, you know what? You're not the only one. You're not the only, it's not just K-12. It's all these small, medium businesses. And so we created those policy templates. We gathered SMEs. And, we did that because we have not created policies before.
Right. And yet there's a lot of .1s that say have a policy for. So
yes, and those are, right. And those are from people who are like, yeah, of course we have these policies and they're in other regulatory frameworks. And of course, that's step one. And so, we brought in SMEs to help us create those IG1 policy templates. And I foresee doing that more. I love the feedback that I get from the MSP community. And, whatever additional resources that MSPs tell me that they need or that they want, I'm happy to look into that and create and, partner with you all. Like, do I need a special document for the MSP market around controls?
Right.
Do we need to look at, like, we talked prior, like tools? People want to know, if I have a Palo Alto, am I compliant with IG1? And I'm not endorsing any tool, but if I have this, I get that all the time. Just what do I need to buy? Can I just buy this? Or I already have this on my network. And so we'd love to do that, with MSPs, maybe if MSPs are interested in that, because we don't have that kind of expertise about tools that MSPs use.
When you and I were talking about this earlier or before the show in our pre-show banter, Pax8 is working on a project just like that, in the sense that we've had those same demands of people saying, hey, on your line card, what does Sentinel-1 cover? Is that 10.1? What does this cover? Is that? And so I've actually taken on a project over the last year where we reached out to our vendors and said, hey, please answer these questions in two lenses. One, how do you serve a control? Like, if you are a DMARC management, are you 9.5, right? Do you serve 9.5 because it says implement DMARC? And the answer would be yes, but where else could you serve? Maybe 2.1, because you can also identify mail sending software that people are using on your behalf as it comes into that lens. And so I asked them just to map that. And the second lens being, do you invalidate a control? If I use your product, can I still single sign on in? Do I still have MFA so I can meet 5.6, and so I can meet 6.7 on provisioning on the access control, and right? So those kind of questions. And of that, I asked you what your thoughts of how many returned in that year, a very perfect and cogent answer to that, and you said 35. You're being very optimistic, and the answer was more like 16, with 5 of which being usable. So we're taking on that project at Pax8. I'm personally leading it, where we're going to start mapping each of our products by line card across CIS, so that if you can say, all right, it meets 9.5, but what needs to be there? Well, maybe you want some language that says you must have it implemented. You must have it in P equals reject. You must have it. And so I'm writing the mapping as well as some of that must-haves language with that we're going to be tying into each of our products over the next year. And so, keep your eyes peeled to that. But that's one of the efforts that, to your point, the community has to build. We have to get those companies involved. We have to bring in subject matter expertise. And, well, we happen to have a lot of that at Pax8. And so I'm utilizing our sales engineers and our teams to build this data set. And we'll gladly be sharing that with MSPs as well as CIS. So
yeah, I mean,
you heard honestly, it here. We'll make sure and share.
Any help you need or anything you need from us, please let us know. I mean, honestly.
Well, I might sanity check, and sometimes I need a slapping of Matt. You're very liberally applying that statement. Right. It's too much. So you get the no vote for most things for me. Okay. That'd be fantastic.
But, yeah. So, as far as like the future of controls, there will be an 8.1. We talked about cybersecurity insurance. I know that through my efforts, through other partnerships that we've had with other organizations around controls, I know that cybersecurity insurers are looking for more out of incident response plans in particular. And so I know our Control 17 incident response, we will be putting more into IG1 because I could never recommend something to any organization. I don't want to not recommend something to an organization, precluding them from getting cybersecurity insurance, right? So at the very least, we'll be doing that. And then we'll see about controls version 9. I do want to be sensitive to the fact that so many organizations have said, I can't keep up with, I just implemented IG1 and IG2, and now you're changing the framework.
You're going to change the whole number set for me? Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
And so we need to kind of slow down our roll and make sure everyone has an opportunity to implement as much as they can, and really figure out when is that good tipping point to, for example, I'll throw this out there, get rid of passwords and require MFA, for example. I've been asked that. And, I have to be cognizant. Yeah, I have to be cognizant of the fact that, as someone from SANS, John Pescatori, said, you have fast followers, not like the cutting edge, right? And so just trying to achieve that balance of who can do 2FA or MFA, who cannot, and not make something unattainable for organizations that use it.
What's interesting about that, and I'd love your thoughts on this, and maybe we're segueing a bit, but a lot of the natty strategy, which I'm not allowed to call it, but the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the natty strategy.
I don't like that one, man.
But a lot,
that's not my
I know,
favorite
buddy. I'm
management.
sorry. I'm sorry, but a lot of that strategy ties to moving the responsibility and accountability up the food chain from those consumers, right? Mm-hmm. And as you think about these SMBs saying, when is the right time for me to have MFA? They don't get to say, when is the right time for me to implement a seatbelt strategy in my car? When is the right time for me to now implement an airbag strategy in my car?
Right.
A lot of that consumer decision has been removed from that same effort of saying, if you sell a Toyota and it kills people, we're going to sue you. You're going to be held liable. And, what are your thoughts on that shift in the strategy and what that could have an impact on controls? Like, the control would hopefully no longer say implement MFA. It would say use products, right? I mean, so what do you think that does?
Yes. So I think that's outstanding. And I am waiting to see what the impact of it is. You mentioned seatbelts. If you recall, the auto industry pushed back so hard.
Books on the matter. Yeah.
I mean, it took, what was his name? A vigilante. I can't remember his name. There was a documentary.
Wasn't Ralph Nader's book, right?
Yes.
Unsafe at Any
Yes.
Speed? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It was his book. Yeah.
And there was a documentary that I watched on him, and someone said, a lot of people thought Ralph Nader was paranoid because he said people were following me and trying to kill me, because people were following him and trying to kill him because the car industry was really opposed. Yeah. And so, from my years in the government and working towards, security automation solutions and using standards, et cetera, it's, there are very many vendors who don't want you to affect their business model. Yeah. These are very powerful vendors.
I love watching how carefully you're choosing your words as you've walked through this. That's just delicious for me, Phyllis, if I'm honest. It's fantastic. That was a nice dance. I saw every step.
Right. I'm not used to that. So yeah, that's the interesting thing is, big companies have big money to pay lobbyists to control legislation or to influence legislation. I won't say control, influence.
Yeah.
And so I'm very interested to see how this all happens. And, this is good because it's a forcing function. You have to start somewhere. So I don't want to be totally pessimistic. I think this is a good step in the right direction. And I know I digress, but I'm going to say one more thing about SBOM.
I love it.
SBOM really is something where it's for the software vendors, because end organizations can't really take advantage of it right now.
Correct.
So if you look at the SBOMs and the mandate around SBOMs, that could possibly be a good way to say, vendors need to keep track of their own software. They have to keep track of their own versions. They have to make meaningful versions, and they have to keep track of, is software patched or is it not patched?
Yeah.
And vendors can do that with SBOMs, and organizations cannot. So I'll get off my
no, it's a great one. Jim Manico took that a step further and said the SBOM isn't even good enough. It needs to be an active, real-time vision of what your dependencies are, and SBOM's just a moment in time, right, in some degree. But I agree with you. That segue stands. I give it points. So it's fantastic. Dom, what are your thoughts on some of this stuff?
Yeah, and I'm rewinding a bit here, but I want to call out, you mentioned a couple times the benchmarks Those are incredibly powerful from a defensibility standpoint. We use them in pro services when we guide our partners through that. We use the benchmarks because I didn't write them, so it's not going to be me in court. I mean, it might be you, but it's not going to be me in court about. I'm just kidding. It's not going to be you either. But you know, we're using this sort of academic baseline, and I also want to point out that the CIS workbench exists, and anyone can go sign up for it. It's workbench.cisecurity.org. Google it, CIS workbench, and you can go see all of the workbenches and where they're at in the development lifecycle, who contribute, and you can contribute to them. Right, so if you are working with CIS and you're seeing a workbench that doesn't make sense, you can go open your own ticket to ask a question and get support on a particular thing in a workbench. And that's the piece of the community here that's really powerful with CIS. So I really wanted to point that out as, one, the benchmarks are great, right? I think it's a fantastic tool. They're walking you through the configuration. It's kind of like a STIG for the average person, right? Secure technical implementation.
Yeah, say STIG.
Right. Yep.
There you go.
Yeah, from the DoD, but it's way more simplified. You don't need an XML parser to read it, and you can get it in PDF format.
Extensible markup
it'll help you configure your software. See, I knew you were gonna get me.
And here's
so
the
those
great
benchmarks
thing
are hugely powerful.
That's awesome because, you know, in our community defense model, we did the work to say, also back implementation group 1 as, hey, these safeguards can defend against the top 5 attacks, to include ransomware, right? Which is something that everyone wants to talk about. And the number one thing you can do, the data shows, the number one thing you can do to defend your network is have a secure configuration. That is the number one thing. Like, if you look at...
That's like a John Maddenism, right? Like, they're simply not winning because they're not scoring enough points. Yeah, they're simply not secure because they're not being secure in their configuration. Yeah, true story.
Right, I mean, it's true. It's like, you know, ransomware, malware, application web hacking, insider privilege and misuse, these top attacks that we've done the research to show really internal to, you know, nationwide, worldwide, regardless of vertical, regardless of size, all organizations are seeing those top 5 attacks. They're not being targeted to any one industry, anyone
and
size.
It's all about hygiene and how you've protected yourself. That means the difference of, at least in the non-targeted, directed nation state threat actors, right? It's going to be the difference maker. And it's so basic and so simple. Phyllis, I've been such a fan of yours for so very long. This is a little bit of a fanboy moment for me. So I'm actually wavering my beard here for everyone, but I'm super happy to have advocates like you driving the success of our nation. My mission personally is focused on this delta that has to happen in our world for our nation. So super happy to have you on my show. This is a one of a lifetime moment for me. So I appreciate having you here. Dom, we got a really cool video.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, anytime.
I really appreciate your efforts, your outreach, and really reaching out to me as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Dom, close us out, buddy.
Thanks so much for joining us. This has been fantastic. We're going to close the show out a little differently, but first let me do all the basics. Please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, all of that good stuff. We want to see you here every week, and don't forget to catch Technically Unraveled, which happened yesterday, but is also happening next Thursday. Here for you every week, all the time, just like the game. With that in mind, let's check out a promo for next week where we're going to talk about AI with our Chief Science Officer, and then we're going to sign off.
You've seen bad...
Ho, ho, ho. What can artificial intelligence do for your MSP business? And what does it mean to the cybersecurity landscape? Technology is moving faster than Donder and Blitzen, and you need to keep up. Join us March 10th on a special AI-themed edition of Pax8 Lives the Game with special guest Pax8 Chief Science Officer Klaus Dimmler. Time to get smart about one of the hottest topics out there right now. See you Friday at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. And on demand. Always. Stay off of my naughty list and get in the game.